Um, yeah, so you've probably seen my LinkedIn already if you're interested in my profile, but my name is Kelvin. I'm currently a consultant at MasterCard Data Services. And yes, we do have a consulting team within MasterCard. Before that, I studied data analytics at Columbia. And before that, I got my undergraduate degree from University of Southern California.
So your question today is, how would you design a bicycle renting app for tourists?
Bicycle renting app for tourists. Well, I cannot type today. Awesome. Thank you for the question. If you don't mind, to make sure that I understand the full context of the goal as well as the objective here, I would like to start with a few clarifying questions.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. So it's pretty clear that we are designing a software app that rents bicycle to tourists. But I would like to be a bit specific because from my past experiences of working and living in China, US, and a few European places, it seems like each place has their own localization of bicycle renting app. For example, in New York City, where I live, they have City Bike, where you have to dock the bike at the docking station. But in China, you don't really have to do that. So I'm curious if we already have a marketplace, a country or a region in mind that we're designing the app specifically for.
I don't have a specific region in mind, but feel free to define it yourself. We do want our app to have a position in the market. So please think about all the competitors and how you want to differentiate yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very glad you brought it up because that was certainly going to be my next question. Can I assume that the goal of this app is to, at least, in the early stage, acquire as many users as possible?
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Do we have any timeline or other constraints that I should be aware of?
No, that I know of.
Okay, got it. Always love it when there's no constraints. Got it. So just to recap, we are designing a bicycle renting app for tourists. We don't have any constraints in terms of timeline, resources, or geography. And the main goal with this app is to acquire as many users as early as possible, as many as possible. Does that track with you?
Yeah.
Awesome. So my last question before I develop my approach, to make this case more fun, should we assume that we are a startup company in this space, or would it make more sense to assume that we are already a team within one of the more established companies? The reason that I'm asking this question is depending on, although we said no constraints, no resources, right? Depending on the existing synergies and capabilities of the team, I feel like the approach and our choice of market could be quite different.
You can define yourself as a product manager at a startup, and you have full capacity of what feature you build or any market you want to enter.
Got it. And based on the fact that we said there's no constraints, I'm going to assume that the startup has decent funding and great engineering capability.
Yep.
Awesome. In that case, do you mind just giving me a quick minute to gather my thoughts and I'll get back to you? Awesome. All right, awesome. So I'm ready to start my approach with this question. So once again, referring back to the prompt here, we are designing a bicycle renting app for tourists specifically, and we don't have any other constraints. However, to make sure that our approach here is as tailored and as actionable and as realistic as possible, I would like to proactively focus on the specific market that I think makes the most sense, which brings us to the next point here, which is which market should we develop the app for? I think it will make sense to steer away from saturated markets. I mean, defining saturated markets here by the definition that not necessarily everybody has a bike in these countries, but perhaps there are already a decent number of players in the market that it will be hard for us as a startup to break into. So a few examples that I could think of on the spot include US cities, such as New York City. China has, Mobike and a bunch of other bike sharing companies that have pretty much made the whole Chinese market into a very saturated market. And a few other examples I could think of would also be European countries, such as Denmark or the Amsterdam, where I'm actually not sure if a ride sharing app for bicycles exists, but just from my past experiences of traveling there, I see that local people already have a habit of using a bike in their daily commute, in which case, even as a tourist, there may already have options for you to rent a bike, in which case it will make it harder for us to enter the market.
Mhm.
And in that case, let's turn our attention to the other segment of markets, which is new markets. And here I'm simply defining new markets, not in a very scientific way, perhaps, but just based on my personal experiences that these countries/cities don't have a existing market of bicycle rental for tourists yet. So certainly feel free to chime in or keep me honest if you disagree with some of my observations, because I will be honest, I am certainly making the new market segment based on my personal experiences.
Mhm.
And looking into the new markets, two Asian countries come to my mind specifically. The first one is Japan, and the second one is South Korea. The reason that I single out these two countries from the many new markets, the other countries that perhaps also don't have an existing bicycle sharing app or market, is that I feel like these two countries historically are great tourist destinations within Asia or even globally, right? I'm personally a great fan of sushi, ramen, and my girlfriend admittedly is a bit of a K-pop fan. So I definitely feel like there has been and will continue to be a high stream of tourists that come to visit Japan and South Korea every year before and after COVID, in which case we don't have to worry about the potential need for tourists sharing bicycles because we know that there will be demand.
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome. In that case, I think both Japan and South Korea are great options. But for the sake of this case, I think looking at just the total number of tourists that visit, Japan does have more tourists per year than South Korea. So I'm going to go with Japan if that sounds good with you.
Yep.
Awesome. So in that case, our prompt has become designing a tourist bicycle sharing app for tourists who are visiting Japan destinations. And to even make our target more specific, we could even already single out some of the more common destinations within Japan that we're specifically designing this app for, such as Tokyo, Hokkaido, and etc. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to take another minute to think about the user segments of the tourists that do visit Tokyo and think about which user segment will make most sense for us to target. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome. Cool, awesome. I think I'm ready to get back to you. So as you can see, I am segmenting the tourists who visit Tokyo based on two dimensions. Are they staying here short term or long term? Short term maybe less than a week. Long term meaning that all of their tourists are staying here for more than a week, and they would like to maybe get more cultural experiences other than just the typical tourist destinations. And also, I want to think about budget because although personally I like riding bikes and I love bike sharing, I think it's a great idea. Bike riding may not be everyone, especially for more affluent tourists who would like to just ride a cab everywhere. Then this app is not for you, right? So this is why I am dividing the tourist segmentation by how long they're staying in Tokyo and what their budget or how affluent they are. Does the segmentation look good to you?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay, awesome, perfect. And in that case, I would also like to highlight a few evaluation criteria that I'm using here to make sure that we're selecting the best tourist segment that are potential target for this app. The most important criteria to me would be the number of potential users, because the ultimate goal for our app is to acquire as many users in a quick time frame. So that is the number one thing of consideration. But in addition to that, I also highlighted two additional evaluation criteria to make sure that the segment that we're targeting is easy to acquire users from. So I think it will be important to evaluate feed for bicycle riding. Even if you love bicycle riding, if you are not in the best shape, then maybe you don't end up using the service a lot, right? And lastly, how familiar the segment is with app, bike sharing / technology in general. So this one refers to how easy would it be for users to adapt to the bicycle sharing service. Does the evaluation metrics make sense to you here? Would it be helpful to add any additional metrics? Certainly let me know if there's any gaps, and I'll be happy to reevaluate.
I think they look good to me.
Okay, awesome. Very glad to hear that. So to evaluate and to make this process easier, since I'm not using Excel, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to represent number of users with U. I'm going to represent fit with F. And lastly, I'm going to represent adaptation with A. And I'm going to rank each group with the highest score of 3 with the lowest score of 1. So, and we'll do this live in a little bit, but if there's a segment that has 3 across the board, then that is probably the segment that we're looking for. Make sense?
Yeah, please do it in quickly because of your time limitation. And yeah, feel free to move on to the next topic you want to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do that. Since we have a bit of a time limitation, I won't actually type out everything. I will just go ahead and select the user segment. I think it will make sense to select the short-term with low budget user group here. Why? Because they are short-term, I feel like they are more likely to have a need for bicycle service because Tokyo has great public transportation. And because they're short-term, where it will be more predictable, in which case it will be easier for the app to allocate bicycles to. Other options could potentially be good too, but I definitely feel like short-term and low-budget company, long-term and low-budget, short-term and low-budget has the biggest number of potential users that we can acquire. And I am crossing out the high-budget segments because firstly, I don't think they realistically have a big need for bicycle sharing. And secondly, I don't think that, I don't think that their expectation of service match what we're offering.
Yeah, sounds good.
Cool, awesome. By the way, how much time do I have?
What was that?
By the way, how much time do I have?
Another 15 minutes.
1.5 or 5.0?
15, 1.5.
1.5, got it. Okay, awesome. Next, I would like to quickly talk about inputs. Give me another 30 seconds and I'll get back to you.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I know that I haven't probably fully developed the framework here for pain points, but I think we're ready to start given the time limitation. So looking across the user journey when you rent a bike, I think that there are 3 pain points that our product needs to address. First is a good user experience. Second is the ability to accept transaction with convenience. And lastly is the safety factor. You definitely want to be safe when you're riding a bicycle, and you don't want to get injured when you are traveling in another country such as you. So you may have noticed that I've actually already ranked the importance of each. I've actually ranked the importance of the pain point based on how important they are. So I do think that user experience is the pain point that we want to adjust here versus transaction or safety. Definitely not saying that safety or easy transaction are not important. In fact, I do think that they're very important. It's just that I think safety or transactions perhaps are more easier to address. And in fact, I do think the market leading apps such as Lyft or Uber or Mobike in China have done a great job of addressing them. So even if we do address these pain points brilliantly, I don't think it will be easy for us to differentiate from other potential competitors in the Japan market. Because even though right now this may be a completely new market, if we're successful in 2 years, other players will also want to have a piece of the cake here. And I feel like the real differentiation that our app could have is really user experience. Does that make sense to you?
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome. And I have also listed a few items specifically on the user experience that I feel like our app should address. And I definitely feel like all of them are important. And since we don't have a specific constraint on timeline, resources, or engineering capability, I would actually suggest that we address all 3 pain points, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So from my experience of traveling in Tokyo and as a short-term tourist, one of my biggest pain points was user experience because of language barrier, not knowing where to go, not knowing how to ride a subway. And this is what I'm defining as the whole user experience. We want to make the process of renting a bike from us, bike to the whatever location you want to be and returning the bike. We want to make that experience as frictionless as possible. And that is my whole goal around addressing these pain points with the features that we're going to have. So diving into the specific pain points here. The first thing I think that's most important in terms of user experience is easy access to rent and return bikes. No matter how good the bikes are or how good other features are, the bikes are no use to tourists if they're not actually close to a tourist destination, right? And I definitely feel like that is going to be a big roadblock that we'll have to tackle at the very beginning of designing an app. Because although app is software-based, renting a bike there's always going to be a hardware component to it. With regard to how good the bike needs to be, I'm no expert, but from my experience of using a bike sharing app service, I do know that the location matters a lot. So in order to implement this feature, what we'll probably need is probably local Japanese talent to negotiate, probably investigate first, but you get what I'm saying, and determine the ideal locations for bike stores. And then we'll probably need to convince the government to give us the space for bike rental. But that's another story and another case. I'm just going to list that as a potential next step for the product. Awesome. Going to the second feature here, which is the language barrier. So once again, referring to my own experience here, I definitely feel like language barrier was a big thing when I first visited Japan. So although some of the stuff were in English, it was still difficult to navigate the streets, and just whatever I wanted to do or buy, it was difficult because I was mainly dealing with people who only spoke Japanese and who are not great at English. So I feel like this represents a great pain point / opportunity for our app to address. So what I would like to suggest in terms of adding features here is that what we should definitely do is to make sure that the app supports multiple languages. And not only that, at the bike stores where users actually rent and return bikes, we should also list common languages, such as English, Chinese, Spanish, the ones that I listed above, to make sure that the process is easy to use, so that it's not just Japanese here and now the tourists have any idea how to actually download the app or use the bike. And lastly, in terms of user onboarding experience, meaning that it's your first time using the app, you have no idea how to rent a bike from us. So maybe we'll show a quick video or a short article. We should also make sure that there's multiple localized language support to make sure that no matter which country you're coming from, or at least 80 or 90% of the tourists would have no problem onboarding to the app and using our service. And the last point that kind of goes hand in hand with my second point, but also just coming back to the overall user experience here, is to offer navigation in app. Because although there are already navigations such as Google Map or Apple Map that offer some sort of navigation in Japan, I do think that it will be a pain point for users to use other navigation apps because they won't know where to find a bike store. And in additionally, this feature, so navigation in app as a feature, this feature would be an added point of great user experience because they will never have to access the app during the whole process. You use the app to rent a bike and then you just input the location that you want to visit. You navigate over there, and now that you're ready to return the bike, you can just tap return in the app and it will show you. So once again, coming back to the whole topic of making sure that the user experience is as frictionless as possible. And I feel like with the features that I've listed here, we are certainly able to address those pain points that I've listed for user experience.
One question, why do you think navigation in the app could be an added point of great user experience? Because what I've seen from other competitors, they already have navigation and map services in the app, why do you think you can differentiate yourself?
Yeah, definitely. So this comes back to the starting cost and the reason that we're starting a new market, right? We will be the first player and we'll set a standard there for Tokyo. And I feel like having navigation in the app will certainly still be a differentiation because it will be a localized version of the app and it will specifically support our bike stores. So once again, making sure that the overall user experience is frictionless. However, I do want to recognize your point that many of the bike rental apps these days do offer some sort of navigation. So I would actually like to add a point here that will further enable our differentiation from our app. I think a good feature to add under navigation is to show and suggest nearby destinations and even recommend when users are just browsing around. So meaning that like even if they're just here for the day, they don't know exactly what to do, we could even give recommendations. And in addition to that, we could even plan out and recommend 1 day bike tours based on location. So this way, we are not only just offering a navigation in the app, we're providing a whole add-on service and experience to them. And yeah, sure, I think other apps eventually would be able to copy these, but I think that this once again sets a standard, and since we'll potentially be the first player in this market, it will create a lot of user acquisition and making sure that most of the tourists recommend our app and service, in which creating a first mover advantage for Lara. But definitely appreciate your question / comment there on the differentiation for navigation part.
Interesting. What else do you think you want to like build to differentiate your app?
Yeah, definitely. So let's say that after 6 months or 1 year of launch, we're very successful with the tourist division. I think it would be interesting to further look at localization because I feel like with ride sharing in general, localization is key. A recent example perhaps is how Uber tried to operate in China and then ended up having to sell its division to Didi. That's a great example of how localization actually is the key differentiator in the market. However, given that the app does focuses on tourists, it will be a little different than localization in the traditional sense, right? So I think that assuming that we'll be successful in 6 months to a year, to further our advantage with the ride-sharing market, I think we'll need to look into specialization into additional or specific tourist segments, tourists who are visiting Tokyo or Japan status. Another route we could potentially take is to expand the targeting user base because there will be many other user segments who will benefit from the last mile bicycle ride sharing service, such as commuters, students, but these will be the local Japanese people, and the experience for them will probably be different than what we're currently offering to tourists. So I definitely see these two potential routes / approaches in terms of just increasing our differentiation from other apps. Does that make sense to you? I realize this is perhaps very high level and focus on strategy, so I'd be happy to talk about specific features as well if that's what you're interested in.
Yeah, I think that is good for now. Please continue.
Yeah, awesome. So with that, I think we're ready to wrap up the case. Would it be helpful to talk about, before we finish, maybe some metrics that we will use to measure the success of the app, and then we can give a summary?
Okay.
Awesome. Once again, I know we are closing to the time, but I do need just a quick minute to gather myself around, and I'll get back to you. Okay, I think I'm ready to go back to you. Awesome. So in terms of metrics, I've once again segmented the metrics that I want to look at to evaluate the success of the app into three categories. We start with the North Star metric star slash vision for the app, which is in the near future, maybe 5 years from now, we want to be the bicycle ride sharing app for people in Japan. Notice that here I'm including both tourists and local people, because as a North Star, I definitely want our mission to be as grand as possible. Meanwhile, our execution can be detailed. And with that, I think to measure the success of our North Star, it would make sense to look at the number of users. And I've segmented the users into local people slash tourists. For local, I think it will make sense to look at monthly active users slash weekly active users. Here we can define the number. Here we can define active usage by maybe at least using a ride per week or month. But based on what actual data and user behavior we see, we can certainly adjust that filter as well. For tourists, it will only make sense if they're in Tokyo or Japan, they will use our service. So I would say that it will be the number of uses per week or month during their stay in Japan. And what goes hand in hand with that, I realized that I've probably already touched on it a little bit, is the number of rides per users. So not only are we looking at the number of users that are considered at the minimum active in the app, we also want to look at how engaged users are. And from there, we could further segment the users and look for growth opportunities, right? For locals, once again, that will probably be rides per week or per month. For tourists, that will be how many rides are they taking per day during their stays in Japan. And the last segment I also want to touch on is user experience, because since we're launching a brand new app, it would be unsmart to assume that the onboarding process or user experience we design will be without errors. In fact, I do expect a lot of errors, in which case we do want to collect data and evaluate metrics around that aspect as well to make sure that we're constantly iterating and improving our app. So the number one metric I want to measure for that segment is the number of finished onboarding and number of unfinished onboarding amount, maybe on a weekly or daily basis. And I'm defining finished onboarding here by that user has downloaded the app and they have completed their first ride. So that means that at least for the first ride that they did, there's no problem. And the reason that I want to highlight this metric on the user experience as the most important metric is that if we're seeing a large number of unfinished onboarding use cases comparing to finished onboarding, then that tells us that something is definitely wrong with our onboarding process. Then we will need to investigate and figure out what the problem is. Additionally, as an external source of feedback, because if you only look internally, you may not always get the most comprehensive picture of how the app is doing. I would certainly also constantly collect feedback and app reviews from the users of the app to make sure that first, we're doing great, get recognition for that, but secondly, see if there's any specific feedback that we should be worried about.
Yeah, makes sense. One last question to you. Have you thought about the go-to-market for your app? If you want to enter a new market, how would you want to make sure that there will be users coming to your app?
Yeah, definitely. I think that was a great question. I think we've touched on the go-to-market strategy a little bit during the case. And as I mentioned, I feel like for a ride-sharing app, it is key to acquire as many users as early as possible, right? And that may include a few factors. If I'm being honest, I don't think I've saw this through very comprehensively. So certainly bear with me if there are gaps that I'm missing. But the number one thing, in my opinion, would be localization. And localization here, could mean so many things, right? Like you said, how are we acquiring users? I think we touched on this in the case in which I said we will offer multiple language support to make sure that the acquisition is as frictionless as possible. But even in addition to that, there are many other things that we need to look at, right? In addition to natural acquisitions through bike stores, bike stalls, how are we going to market our new app? Right, because I'm working in a U.S. environment. I don't necessarily know what the Japanese marketing looks like, and we may need to employ local talent. And that is another part of localization, which is to enlist local talent who actually have first-hand context on how an app grows and markets in Japan. And even to go beyond that, it may not be the worst idea to enlist the help or a partnership with a local company, right? Like, so I know that Google has a big presence in Japan, so maybe as well as Yahoo or even SoftBank. So these are certainly potential partners that understand the use case of a ride-sharing app from other places in the globe, who also have the resource and capability to help the app launch and grow in Japan. So once again, realizing that this isn't a comprehensive picture fast because I'm thinking on the fly, but those will be a few points that I want to look at in terms of the go-to-market strategy.
Okay. And I know we're on time, so let's jump into feedback. How about that?
Yeah, sounds good.
First, what do you think about your answer?
I think I did fine. I was nervous in the beginning. I didn't think I would be, but I actually was quite nervous. So that was a new experience. I almost felt like I couldn't type. That wasn't great. But I think overall I did well. I almost wish the follow-up questions was a bit harsher, because I felt like except for maybe the first one, the other follow-up questions I did handle fairly well. I like that I delivered a pretty full structure, and I constantly asked for your feedback on your alignment. Yeah, I think maybe if I could have controlled the flow of timing a little bit better. So I realized I was spending probably too much time in the beginning, but definitely picked up the speed and pace once you prompted me to hurry the fuck up.
Yeah, your feedback is pretty objective. Feedback from me, I think there are several points that you did pretty well. First, market analysis is pretty good. Basic criteria like saturation and travel industry and user behavior are mentioned in your analysis, and geo is critical in this case, and you took that into consideration as well. And your answer is very structured, and it's specifically like your communication. You talk about your experience traveling in different countries and your girlfriend's experience, which is a very easy way to like make the interviewer feel closer to you. And also, I really like your strategic thinking. So at the beginning, you kind of narrow down the strategy and what you really want to build as a product and what is the product strategy. That is pretty nice. And also, like you said, you handle follow-up questions pretty well. Follow-up question is an opportunity the interviewer give you to show your potential, to show your capability of a specific criteria. So basically, if the interviewer wants to help you and they see you maybe lack of something in your answer, they will ask you a follow-up question to see whether you have the ability to deal with that. So these are the positive feedback from me. Some of the potential improvements you might want to have. The first one is, this is a question about the marketplace, and you didn't even mention the supply side. Where do the bikes come from, right? Like, do you have a bike company? Do you have partnerships? Can you differentiate your app by your bike? Maybe you want your bike to sit, like to show differently compared with their competitors because you're specifically building it for tourists? Or do you want to even add a camera on the bike to maybe like shoot videos for the tourists as a part of their memory? And despite the solution of using local expert to tell you where to locate the bikes, how can you manage supply chain and make sure users can find a bike when they need one? Right? These are the ways how you can maintain a marketplace, how you can make sure that the supply could match with the demand. So that is actually the part I'm looking for, but you haven't mentioned it in your answer. And navigation in the app cannot be a differentiator. I talk about that as a one of the follow-up questions. Basically, the question that I want to ask is if, right, like you are targeting a new city, right? If, let's say, Lyft or Uber want to enter this market, are they going to be easier to enter this market than you building a new app, right? So if you cannot find a way that Lyft or Uber are not doing right now, then it is very hard for you to maintain your position in that market. So they have more experience managing the marketplace. They have more experience to manage the supply. So they probably will enter this market easier than what you are doing right now. So, but you, like I asked you the follow-up question and you talk about like dive deeper into what your tourists really want. That is a good part, but still I will expect more creative ideas from you, because here I specifically tell you that we want to target tourists, right? It is a way for you to show your empathy, how you want to understand the tourist. It is not only about languages. You might want to think about other scenarios. They might need help from our product. And apart from that, you let your interviewers wait too long. You probably figured that you didn't put that much content on your doc. Well, we already passed 20 minutes. That is because when you share your screen, when you are typing while you're talking, you will slow yourself down. So you probably, if you want to share your screen, you probably want to just put one word for each bullet point and quickly like talk right through. Don't let your type speed slow your speaking down. And lastly, go-to-market. Always remember, if you are talking about go-to-market strategy, how you want to enter the new market, there are two things you want to mention. The first one, what are your channels, right? What are your channels that you want to get to your users, right? Are you going to maybe send physical advertisement on their airport, right? Like in their airport, or do you want to maybe notify all the tourists on their planes, right? This is the channel. This is how you get to your users. And the second thing you want to mention is the message you want to send to your users. So instead of maybe telling the users that we can get you from A to B as a way of your transportation, we probably also want to tell the tourists that it is going to be a great companion on your trip, right? We can not only serve as a transportation, we can also provide you a great user experience. So when it comes to go-to-market, these are the two things you want to mention, and it will help you to make your answer more structured.
Got it. Thank you so much. That was great feedback. I do have a few follow-up questions if we have time.
Yep.
Awesome. Do we always mention go-to-market strategy for product design questions? I was actually a bit surprised by that when you asked.
No, not all the time, but for this specific case, because you are entering a new market, plus there will be a lot of supply chain question coming up. So go-to-market is a very typical question the interviewer will ask in this case.
Got it. Makes sense. Thank you for that. And my other question is regarding to the supply side. I certainly agree that that was a big gap in my answer. I feel like I was my own enemy in the sense that I follow the usual framework, and the usual framework starts with users and pain points, right? And when I followed that route, I was like there was just no prompt for me to even talk about supply side. Although, like somewhere in my mind, I was like, yeah, bike is important, right? How would you recommend mitigating that? Because I feel like that's going to be potentially a pretty big pitfall for me.
The way that I'm dealing with this problem is before my user segmentation, I will talk about my stakeholders. So I will put the bike supplier as one of my stakeholders. even maybe bike manufacturers into my stakeholders. And after talking about the stakeholders, I will talk about what I really want from the bike manufacturers. Probably not at that time, I wasn't clear about what I really want for the users, but probably like mention them afterwards when I'm clear about which user segment I want to target. So you probably want to mention that as one of your stakeholders at the very beginning of your answer. And then when you talk about pain point from the users, when you talk about solution for the consumers, you want to go back to what you want, what are your requirements from the bike suppliers.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And in terms of how much time you spend on each segment, because I feel like I spent too much time in the beginning, how would you recommend going about that?
Yeah, I won't blame you on that because for this question, you definitely need to take a lot of time on strategy. So that's why when it comes to, I remember it was your user segmentation. I told you don't prioritize it, just to tell me what you want, because at that time I want you to have enough time for pinpoint a solution. I think if it is a great interviewer, they will definitely remind you your time. But typically, you want to spend half of your interview, like your time, on pinpoint a solution. So if it is a 20 minutes interview, you want to spend 10 minutes on pinpoint a solution. And for the other 10 minutes, I suggest you probably take 5 minutes on strategy in this case, and the other 5 minutes on like whatever like user segments and the metrics you want to talk about.
Yeah, got it. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. Thank you for the great interview. This was great. I feel like I learned a lot from you, so really appreciate it.
No worries. Plus, I really like your metrics analysis. It's pretty.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and I think it is very like a very typical way for us to analyze the metrics when it comes to our day-to-day life. So it is really realistic and practical and pretty comprehensive.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I will add that you are a very scary interviewer. I felt like you did not smile for a single time during our interview, and I was like, fuck, I must be doing something wrong. So, all right, awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.